Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's episode features Amanda Seibert. She is a cannabis writer, award-winning journalist, photographer, videographer, and the author of The Little Book of Cannabis: How Marijuana Can Improve Your Life. It was released in October, published in October of 2018, which is the same month that Canada federally legislated access to recreational cannabis for adults, which I guess equates to being legalized, although my thoughts on that are contained in the episode. Either way, we've got her on the show. She is a wealth of knowledge on the subject, and it was fun to have the conversation with her. One sort of point of consideration, though, about the conversation is that this episode was recorded almost a year ago. It was at the beginning of 2019, possibly even the end of 2018, I'm not sure. And it's taken this long to release. Sometimes it happens with some of the episodes. But the point there is that we talk about the science, and since it's been essentially a year and cannabis is now, quote, legal in Canada, there's been a lot more science. So I'm going to include some updated stuff in the show notes of this episode. Actually, a lot of science came out to further validate the suggestions that Amanda is going to give you in this episode, which was cool to see, and some generally new stuff. So I'm going to put some updated cannabis stuff in the show notes to this episode, which will be at jameswjesso.com. Cannabis is a big topic. I like cannabis. I like cannabis quite a bit, although I have personally been moving away from using it too often these days. But as the podcast develops, we've only done a couple episodes about cannabis. I'd like to do more. I'd specifically like to focus on cannabis as a psychedelic, as a ceremonial psychedelic. And so you'll see some content coming out around that in the next year or so as the content sort of develops. I'm just currently, according to timeframes and whatnot, this episode's coming out while I'm in Australia or just leaving Australia. I can't remember what date exactly this one's coming out. So the upcoming content of the podcast is going to be it's still ambiguous, although I have several episodes still lined up for you guys, already recorded, and lots of cool ideas coming into the future. But keep watch for more cannabis related content over the next several months to a year. Feeling excited about getting that. Speaking of excited, I am also excited just to drop into this interview very shortly. But first, I want to give a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon. Without you, this podcast wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be able to feel so much joy and enthusiasm to create it for you. And everyone else who appreciates the show would not be able to also enjoy it, learn from it, and garner, and not only just garner, but to echo out value into the world as a consequence of the conversations that the podcast holds. So thank you, patrons, for doing that. The people whose names are listed on the screen on YouTube or in the description of this episode are people who are giving $23 or more a month, some of which for a very long time. So really, thank you. If you're not a patron yet, I would love for you to become a patron. You can do so by heading to patreon.com/JamesWJesso, or you can head to jameswjesso.com/support to see other support options, including PayPal, buying t-shirts or art from the store. Additionally, a new opportunity is that this podcast is now sponsored by a nootropics company called Formula that makes custom stacks for people depending on their needs and what works for them. I've personally been using it for some time. I find the creativity stack to be really good for me. The best results with the least recoil for my personal experiences. Fully on par, slightly different, but fully on par with the Paul Stamets stack, with, for me, more sustainability over the long term. So yeah, something interesting to consider there. If you're interested in nootropics, you can head to the link in the description to this episode. Use the promo code Jesso, Jesso, to get 20% off your first order. So yeah, check them out if you're into nootropics. But that's it for the intro. Please enjoy this episode with Amanda Seibert here on Adventures Through the Mind, and I will catch you on the outro. All right, well, hey Amanda, what's up? Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be.
It's almost like a quasi covert second interview. Covert because no one's ever going to hear the first one, but
Thank goodness.
but not quasi because everyone now knows it's a second interview.
Hmm.
Let's start right off the bat. Your book,
Hmm.
A Little Book About Cannabis. That's what it's called, correct? Yeah.
Yes, a little
Uh,
book of cannabis.
and I really enjoyed it. I found it to be a great read, especially as it's almost like a primer
Mhm.
for the average North American population to get a sense of, what is this plant really, and what can it offer you, and utilizing, you have interviews with, um, different professionals, researchers, scientists, clinicians. You also have a bunch of anecdotal reports, and it was a good read. Felt like an excellent book to be brought onto the scene at the start of legislation allowing for recreational use here in Canada. So thanks for your wonderful book.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, it was my pleasure. It's a really exciting topic to dive into, especially in the context that I did. You know, the subheading for my book is how marijuana can improve your life, and so really, there's no. I'm not really dancing around it. I really do believe this is something that can improve people's lives. So I'm happy to have spoken to it and written about it.
Okay, so why don't we start out specifically looking at the plant? What's in this plant
Hmm.
and how what's in this plant interacts with the human body and brain. So maybe you could just give us a general rundown of the phytochemical profile of cannabis.
Absolutely. So, cannabis, unlike any other, single molecule drug or substance that we see on the market, because it has so many different compounds in it. Cannabinoids, namely, are one type of those compounds, and two that we know a lot about are THC and CBD. And then, of course, we have these other compounds called terpenes, and I'll get into those in a minute. But with THC and CBD, what they do is they work within the body in the system called the endocannabinoid system. And they also mimic these compounds that we have within our own body, which is pretty fascinating. So THC, CBD, I'll break them down a little bit. The first we know is a sort of psychoactive compound. It creates the sort of high or euphoria that you might experience when you use cannabis. People find that it's useful for them for pain and things like anxiety, depression, and so on and so forth. CBD, on the other hand, has been known to not necessarily cause these psychoactive, or pardon me, not psychoactive, but intoxicating sort of feelings that you might get with THC. And in that case, it's also been shown to help with pain, with anxiety, with other things. And really, the fascinating thing about these cannabinoids is when they are in your body, they work with each other to sort of help each other work better. So once they're interacting with the endocannabinoid system, I'll break that down a little bit. It's the system within our body that really regulates all the other systems within our body. That's kind of the simplest way of putting it. And within that system, we have different receptors kind of located throughout our bodies. There are two sort of varieties that have been studied really intensely, and they're called CB1 and CB2 receptors. And CB1 are predominantly located in your brain, but also throughout the body, in, like your pancreas and your liver and other areas. And then the CB2 receptors are predominantly located in your immune system. And so these cannabinoids, THC and CBD, they sort of work within that system to help regulate. They're attracted to these receptors, and where THC will sort of bind to the receptor, CBD will sort of kind of dance around CB1 and CB2. They sort of work in a little bit different fashion. But really what these things do is they mimic the endocannabinoids, the endo meaning, within your body, that we produce naturally. And they have interesting names as well. The first is anandamide, and that actually comes from the word bliss. So it's really thought of as this bliss molecule. And what that means is it's sort of helping to regulate your body in the absence of cannabinoids from cannabis. And then we also have 2-AG, which is another endocannabinoid. It exists within the body. And that, again, works within that system. The idea or the theory is that THC and anandamide are sort of similar, and that CBD and 2-AG are sort of similar. They work in similar fashion within the body. So, for example, if you're, feeling kind of low, dysregulated, maybe you're feeling really stressed out or anxious, that is absolutely tied to your endocannabinoid system. And when that's happening, your body is trying to re-regulate yourself. Anandamide and 2-AG are trying to do that work, but you've also got this, it's tricky, you've got these enzymes in your body that are trying to interrupt that process. What I learned from Dr. Ethan Russo in my book is that, not only do THC and CBD sort of work to replicate those cannabinoids in the body, CBD specifically actually interrupts those enzymes that are trying to kill your own endocannabinoids. So really interesting that, these sort of things that are produced in cannabis, the way they sort of kind of help to regulate your body. Really, I mentioned anxiety, but there are all sorts of other things that, could sort of put you into dysregulation. And I think that's why we see cannabis helping people in so many different ways, because it works in this major system in the body that is really in control of all the other systems within the body. And I think it's incredible that the discovery of the cannabinoids in cannabis helped us or led us to this discovery of this other system in our bodies.
Interesting. So there's a couple pieces I want to break down there before we get into terpenes. I'll start with that last point, which is that, the discovery of cannabinoids led us to discovering the endocannabinoid system, which is that we discovered them in the plants first, and then later we figured out, there's a whole system in the body that is already producing similar compounds in a related way as to how we ended up calling the endorphins that we have based off of morphine. We had discovered morphine first, and then we found, this is like a morphine that's produced inside the body, so we'll call it N. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, totally. So, definitely a really, fantastic discovery. And there's still so much to learn about it.
So, furthermore, having just expanded on that, the question is about how the two of these work together. So it's commonly sort of touted amongst the media and amongst, I guess, the culture that CBD is non-psychoactive. In our previous discussion, you had something to say about that.
Absolutely. So I think non-psychoactive is definitely a misnomer. You think of the number of people that are touting CBD for anxiety, for depression, for things that are happening in the mind. I mean, automatically, if CBD is sort of interrupting that negative, thought process or whatever it might be in your brain, that means it's a psychoactive substance, regardless of whether or not, you're feeling high or stoned or, intoxicated, as the government likes to call it. And so I think, calling it non-psychoactive is a little bit inaccurate. I think it's definitely better to refer to it as non-intoxicating, not euphoric, things like that. And, the majority of scientists do agree. We are beginning to sort of see that change in people's vocabulary. So that's good.
So there's also, you had explained it differently. You said that THC comes in, binds to CB1 receptors, and CBD comes around and like dances around what's going on. And both of them have their separate biological and psychoactive effects. But I'm often hear people saying, well, CBD counteracts the negative effects of THC, especially insofar as anxiety and other things. Now, when it's doing that, is it stopping the THC from doing something? Is the presence of CBD mitigating other effects of the THC, maybe the medicinal effects? Or is it just somehow modulating the THC's psychological intensity so as to have it be more easeful experientially?
Definitely the latter. I mean, studies that we've come up with to this point, the discussions that I've had with experts, really CBD is modulating that sort of psychoactive effect of THC. In many senses, CBD can help THC work better. So if you're using it for pain and things like that, it can actually make the THC more effective while taking away some of those psychoactive effects. Even Health Canada, has written on its website that if you're intoxicated from too much THC, you're not feeling very pleasant, that CBD can actually counteract some of those effects. So even though it might seem counterintuitive to take more cannabis after you're feeling unpleasant from taking too much cannabis, definitely plenty of science to show that CBD does in fact really modulate that, can cut that down. And I've experienced it myself. You do a dab and perhaps it's a little bit too strong, and I got to sit down and I take a little bit of CBD oil, and in 10 or 15 minutes, I'm feeling pretty good. So I think, that's my personal experience, but I've heard many similar stories from other people. And so it really is, it's part of that bigger idea you might have heard, of course you have the entourage effect, the idea that all of these compounds are working with each other together, and, helping each other to work better, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about isolation then, because there's CBD isolate. I actually had some CBD isolate like 2 minutes before we started this interview, because
Awesome.
I have it. It's like sitting here on my desk, and I'm about to interview Amanda. I think it'd be a good idea to have a little CBD. Why not? And that it's quite popular, these CBD isolate extracts suspended in oils or vaporizers, or just the powder that I have. And then there's also THC extracts, distillate, for example, and synthetic THCs like Marinol. Can you just talk about sort of your thoughts around isolation of these compounds, what it might be good for, and where the dangers might lie?
Totally. Well, I'll start that, I guess, by looking at Marinol or Sativex, these sort of drugs that we've developed that are just THC on its own. And these sort of came as a result of people using medical cannabis, as a whole plant, and then, the pharmaceutical industry trying to recreate it. And
To
obviously,
profit off it.
yes, of course,
Yeah.
essentially. Really, I mean, in the words of Dr. Ethan Russo, THC on its own is a lousy drug. It, he says it doesn't create euphoria, it creates dysphoria. And I really like that. I think it just paints a very clear picture. That being said, people that are consuming, really high percentage, THC products. I think for the most part on the unregulated market in Canada, Canada cannabis. I'm constantly saying these words. A lot of the products that we're using are coming from, whole plant extracts. You mentioned, isolates, but aside from those, most of the stuff that we're using when we're creating dabs, shatter, whatever, oils, capsules, even on the legal regulated side, these are coming from the whole plants. And what that does is, you're getting all of the plant in there. You're getting, even if it's just a little bit of CBD, you're getting the terpene profiles. And so those compounds are able to work together in the body, modulating each other. When you take them on their own, now I can't speak to CBD on its own because I've never taken it by itself. And I know that it's very popular for people, I think, obviously, because it doesn't come with those euphoric, sort of intoxicating effects. You don't have to worry.
Or dysphoric, yeah.
Exactly. So you don't really have to worry about that when you're taking CBD on its own. But with THC, absolutely. I mean, I have not heard a pleasant thing about it being used on its own. A friend of mine was prescribed one of these THC isolated prescription drugs, and she just said it was horrible. It made her feel worse. That's one person's story. But again, just going back to what researchers have told me and what science says about, how it creates a sort of dysphoria, I would say, sticking to cannabis-derived products that are coming from an entire plant, it's definitely the way to go. I would probably stay away from isolated THC.
Mm-hmm. Cool. But you wouldn't necessarily stay away from isolated CBD.
No, which is, I think obviously because of that, the psychoactivity that it does not include. And you're seeing it being used on its own. Like in BC, I think every time CBD products come into the regulated store, it's like a day or two and they're all sold out because people are just, really excited about this product. So I think there's something definitely to be said for CBD on its own, but THC, perhaps not.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Now let's slide. I have this itching, since psychological sensation that I'm forgetting something. And if it's obvious to the listeners, I'm sorry, maybe I'll remember later. But I want to move into these other compounds that are in the cannabis plant, the terpenes. Can you talk about those, please?
Absolutely. So terpenes are really the aromatic compounds in cannabis that give it its unique smell. So let's say you go to your local dispensary or your shop and you're smelling the flowers. You know that one might smell kind of lemony, or another might smell kind of floral or like lavender. This comes from the terpenes. So limonene is a popular one. That's one that sort of is that citrus profile you'll find in like a lemon skunk or or super lemon haze. That lavender or sort of floral smell might come from a terpene called linalool, more of a floral profile to it. And these terpenes are used, in all sorts of products, household cleaning products, aromatherapy products, but they're also everywhere. They're in all sorts of plants. Pinene is another popular one. That's sort of that similar smell to the forest, I guess you would say. And there are about, it's hard to say, but people have ventured to guess that there's about 200 of these terpenes that could be found in various quantities in cannabis. Right now, our knowledge on exactly how it works with cannabinoids is not super solid, but we do know that it's working together with these with THC, with CBD, and of course the other cannabinoids like THCV and so on. So I think terpenes are really going to be the way that moving forward, people are going to be identifying their preferred strains or cultivars of cannabis, because I think this whole indica sativa thing is sort of starting to fall away a little bit, and terpenes are really, when you break it down, a much more accurate way of determining what you are going to enjoy about cannabis. The smells, of course, are subjective. Not everyone's going to enjoy the same thing, but really a good way of identifying. Let's say you walk into your shop and they don't have the strain you're used to purchasing. If you find something with a similar terpene profile, you might be able to sort of replicate that experience a little bit more. So it's less about THC and CBD than we really think it is. And I think it has a lot more to do with terpenes.
So the terpenes have like a modulatory effect on the psychoactivity of the cannabinoids, but do they have any effect on their own? Like I was with a friend the other day, and we were wondering aloud about these things, and he had thought to himself, if the terpenes play such a powerful role in the psychoactivity of cannabis, can I get high from terpenes alone? Like, can I just smoke basil leaf and will I get stoned or something? What do we know about the actual pharmacological psychoactivity of these terpenes on their own?
Very little. Definitely not as studied as the other compounds in the plant, for sure. That's definitely a question that is on people's minds. How are these things going to interact on their own? I think there are some terpenes that, isolated, if you consume them, I can't name them, but that if you consume them on their own, you could die. They're, technically toxic compounds. And so, not all of them, but some of them, for sure. And so I think that on their own, the study, has yet to come. I think we have sort of an idea about how these things react. I always refer back to like aromatherapy because it's something that people are familiar with and they understand. Lavender, you inhale something that has that profile to it, and perhaps you feel relaxed or calm. And so people are sort of applying that idea that they have about these terpenes, that okay, it has this effect, it's uplifting or it's relaxing or it's pacifying or what have you, and they're sort of applying that to the terpene profile of cannabis. And I think there's definitely it's definitely a thing that needs some more study, but anecdotally, we are really seeing that these terpenes have a massive, profound effect on the experience that you're going to have when you're consuming. Definitely more so than the terpenes, more so than the cannabinoids.
Interesting, yeah.
So.
I mean, when you were talking about, like some of these terpenes on their own can kill you, I thought about dilimonene, which is used for extracting DMT from acacia or Mimosa hostilis or whatever. and that it's certainly not something that you would want to take a big whiff of while you're working with it. And other these essential oils are really, they're used in household cleaning products. So definitely something to consider there. One thing, I already know that it's true, but I'm going to bring it into the conversation, and then hopefully I won't have it debunked and the placebo effect that it was providing destroyed, is utilizing terpenes in black pepper to counteract anxiety produced by too much THC.
Absolutely. So this is something I've heard, I've read about. A woman I interviewed in my book, Mara Gordon, has told me about this. And this comes from a terpene called beta-caryophyllene. And it is very common in black pepper, in cloves, and cinnamon, I think, as well. And it's sort of that spicy profile that you sometimes get when you smell a different strain. And so the idea behind beta-caryophyllene is if you're feeling a little bit anxious from your cannabis consumption, maybe a little bit too much THC, beta-caryophyllene can actually cut some of that anxiety. And that is because it's been noted as one of the, I think it is so far the only terpene that has been shown to sort of interact with the receptors in the endocannabinoid system. So it sounds kind of silly and hokey, and you might not believe it, but the idea that, if you're feeling a little bit too high, you smell a little black pepper, it can actually mitigate some of that. It sounds so weird and simple, but chemicals, I don't know. It's really cool.
I have leaned into it, not for myself, but I've had, friends and friends of friends, call me. I mean, this is, what I do. Other people know what I do. So they're like, oh, somebody's tripping out because they ate 2 million wheat cookies. Call James. What do we do? How do we support them? And my answer is always like, give them some nice black pepper to just not huff on, but have it in front of their face that they can be smelling it.
Chew on like one of those black pepper kernel things.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So and every time it comes back with that worked. Took about 20 minutes, but that totally worked. So yeah, interesting stuff there. There's a couple more pharmacological questions I have.
Totally.
But first, I want you to expand on something that you said there about the, us leaning away from the sativa hybrid indica model of understanding psychoactivity of cannabis. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. What is sort of if I say current, I know you're in the cutting edge, but I mean current in the sense of where the culture is between cannabis and indica and sativa, and where the actualities are. What is the actual fact of the matter?
Totally. So culturally, the idea that, these two species of cannabis plant, indica and sativa, that they produce different effects. So if the idea has been for a long time that an indica dominant strain is going to make you sleepy or relaxed, and a sativa dominant strain is going to make you feel uplifted. It's going to make you be able to clean your house and go about your day and all of this. And so for a long time, this has been sort of what people have believed. But studies have shown that, there is really no difference between these plants at a sort of molecular level. Yes, physiologically, a sativa plant is going to grow much taller. It's going to look a little bit different than an indica plant, which is going to be shorter. It might have broader leaves. Indica plants typically grow in a colder climate, and so that's why they're a little bit more stout. They are going to grow in a different way. But when it comes to the effects of these plants, I think at this point in time we've done so many. There's so much interbreeding and crossing of different strains that pretty much everything you find on the market at this point is a hybrid, unless something is pulled out of the ground and from Afghanistan or Colombia. You're not going to get a pure indica or a pure sativa anywhere really. This is and so I think that as we sort of move away from that idea, terpenes are sort of coming into that. Now, this is definitely still very common. You see it everywhere in all the government stores, indica dominant, sativa dominant, and it really is has been a way for people to identify what they like and what works for them. But I think, now that cannabis is legal, we can do better than that. We can come up with better ways for us to determine what works for us. And I think terpenes is the way that is going, because of the way you can really identify specific compounds and chemicals that are going to work for you. I know some people that really hate like really gassy strains of cannabis, and others that are really like, they really don't like something that has like a fruity profile to it. And so I think if we start talking about cannabis in this way, rather than I like this really good indica or whatever, it's more specific. It's better for consumers because it's it's more pinpointed, it's more exact than it's indica dominant, which really doesn't mean a whole lot at this point. Yeah.
I feel excited about the idea of there being government-funded cannabis sommeliers that like sample everything and then write up the descriptions for these different strains on the cannabis stores, which is great in BC, but super lame online store in Ontario. Just super lame. Oh my goodness. But Ontario is a pretty lame place. I mean, Doug Ford is our premier. I mean, for the Americans, they don't give a shit about this, but it's like
it's like night and day, the differences between some of the provinces.
Yeah. Well, I guess people in the US can understand there's a pretty damn big difference between Texas and California, right? So but let's leave Canadian politics out of this until they're specifically cannabis related and later. Okay, more things about pharmacology. What do we know? Okay, so we know that CB1 receptors are being activated, CB2 receptors are being activated, whole body, but concentrated in the brain. Obviously, it wouldn't have a psychoactive effect if it wasn't interacting with the brain. What is the consequence of the CB1 receptors or CB2? I know CB1 predominantly in the brain. What are the consequences of that on the neuropharmacological profile of the brain? Does it have an impact on serotonin, on dopamine, on oxytocin, on norepinephrine? Do we know what specific neurotransmitters are being modulated by activating the CB1 receptors in the brain?
We do, and I think serotonin has a lot to do with it. I mean, THC has been shown also to increase melatonin production in the brain, which is why helps people sleep in some cases. I think that you're asking what are the negatives of these receptors being kind of turned on by cannabis. I think.
Well, I'm not asking about negatives. I'm asking about like neutral, like this is what we know. I'll ask you about negatives afterwards. I'm just curious about like what is happening from a perspective of just what's happening, not from a perspective of good or bad necessarily.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see, where should I start with this? Yeah. So when those compounds, when THC, CBD are entering the body, you're seeing that interaction with the receptors. You're seeing, it obviously has an effect on your serotonin levels. Beyond that, I'm going to say that my knowledge is perhaps a little bit, once we start getting into these other chemicals in the brain, that's where my knowledge kind of falls off a little bit. But I do know for a fact, serotonin is affected. I think that this is something for sure that would be perhaps a question for someone who's perhaps a little bit more scientific minded than I am. I am just a writer. But right. I do know for sure that, pardon me. Yeah, this is definitely something that my knowledge does not quite reach.
Well, let's step back. I'll get you back on the front foot here, and I'll save that for a neuroscientist, which later on I would love to get. I'm sure you know the right neuroscientist for me, so I'll get you to put me in contact with them. Okay, so I've forgotten what was next. I had something else. It's so weird. Today is all about that like itching feeling like I'm forgetting something. Let's just move into what these things can do for you. So yes, we know cannabis can help you sleep. You just mentioned melatonin production. Very cool. Didn't know that. Cannabis can help you feel relaxed. It can help with anxiety. Cannabis can surprisingly also help people feel more focused. Now, there's a few, pain management, okay? But there's a few other examples of the role of cannabis in medicine that were sort of not entirely a surprise, but interesting to hear about in your book. The first one will be sex life, that it helps improve sexual experiences. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. This for me was like such a fun chapter to write. Really interesting history around the use of cannabis and sex. And I think, there's a couple different uses for it. So I'll start kind of at the most simple level and how that can sort of benefit your experience. And then I'll take it to sort of the most, in depth, I guess. But if, let's say, you've heard about cannabis and sex and you want to try something simple, topicals are a great way to start out. A lot of women, men as well, maybe you're experiencing kind of unpleasant feelings during sex, or it's not comfortable, what have you. These THC infused topicals, lubes, massage oils have really become popular on the kind of underground market. I guess they're not available legally yet. And so what they do is really THC helps to sort of make that experience more pleasurable. If you're taking cannabis, in a capsule form or an oil, or you're smoking a joint, you're going to have a little bit of psychoactivity added to that as well. And what that, has done for a lot of people, for myself and a few people that I interview in the book, it kind of takes the anxiety away from sex, or the feeling that you have like 100 million thoughts in your mind and you can't focus, and you want to be present in that kind of situation. So the idea that cannabis can help you feel more present, you're more in touch with your own needs, more in touch with the needs of your partner. These are all things that anecdotally have been told to me, but when we look at the science of it, we do see actually that cannabis users have more sex than people who don't use cannabis. That people who use cannabis actually they experience this feeling that they want to be close to people, and there's science to back that up. I think going back to the 1970s, that one study I think said something like cannabis users were more cuddly or something than people who didn't use cannabis. So definitely speaking to the idea that it fosters a bit of a connection between you and your partner. That's kind of just at the base level how cannabis can help. But if you're someone who experienced sexual trauma, perhaps, or it's just tied to some really negative things in your life. I've spoken with a handful of women who've gone from completely celibate, like I can't do this ever again, to like really having wonderful sex lives because they've introduced cannabis and slowly overcome some of that trauma in their lives. So super powerful in that context, I think, as well.
So you suggested that topical administration doesn't produce psychoactivity. I'm curious about that because, especially if it's being used as a lube, I mean, you're ultimately putting a psychoactive molecule into a mucous membrane, which I assume would create some level of psychoactivity. There'd obviously be localized pain management or pain reduction and relaxation. But especially, there's the stories of, the witches of the past, and they would rub their ointments on their broomsticks and grind into them and get high and right and enjoy the fruits of their witchcraft. So is there a psychoactivity that's related to utilizing a THC infused lubricant?
In my experience, the psychoactivity is really brought into the picture when you're smoking or using a capsule or an oil or what have you. That being said, if you're super sensitive to THC, if you're someone who doesn't use it often, try finding a product perhaps that is lower in THC if you want to avoid that. But I think if there is any psychoactivity associated with it for people who have a lower tolerance, it's only going to contribute to your experience. I think it's only going to help you make you feel more present. That would be my.
Yeah, I guess I mean, like, if the sex is good, you're high as fuck anyway. So like, how are you going to know the difference, right?
You're going to be fine. Yeah, I think. I'm just going to stop talking.
It's fine. This is a pretty like taboo-free zone here on my podcast. Okay, so an interesting segue. You're talking about resolving sexual trauma, different forms of administration. During the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver last year, 2018, one of the speakers was Selena Wong, and she talked, and she's also one of the people in your book. And I'll ask you about that specifically, but one of the things she brought up was sort of, say, clinical evidence now from practice that vaginal suppositories of cannabis seem to produce experiences or have the effect of helping women resolve sexual trauma. Have you heard much about this?
I have heard about vaginal suppositories being useful and about cannabis sort of resolving that sexual trauma, but not those two tied together. So that is really interesting to me. I totally believe it. I mean, Selena does some really incredible work in that respect. I think, suppositories are definitely, you just mentioned taboo. I think, the reason we're not seeing that area explored yet by the government, who has just legalized cannabis. I mean, there's so many medical patients that could really benefit from this kind of administration. One, of course, sexual trauma is one area, but pain administration as well. If you're suffering from pain, suppositories are incredibly useful for that purpose too. And so I think this is something we really need to dive into from a medical perspective, because the uses are so numerous. Definitely something I'd like to explore further for sure.
Yeah, I'm interested too. I've never shelved anything, but possibly I will. I'll start small, like maybe 2 milligrams or something. All right. So moving on then, Selena's featured in your book talking about the role cannabis can play in the dyeing process. Can you give us just a very short backstory of her case report and what that sort of means insofar as cannabis's role in the dyeing process?
Absolutely. So Selena is, for a long time, she was a caregiver for her grandparents, for her Oma and Opa. And her Opa was dealing with pain, getting to the age where he was having trouble going to the bathroom, things like that, while her Oma was going through sort of Alzheimer's and dementia, not having very many lucid moments, and so what she started doing, first for her grandfather, was administering a little bit of infused strawberry jam, like on a piece of toast. And she would just say, here's a little bit of special jam, and it was low dose, it's going to make you feel better. And of course, he had to sort of get over this idea of cannabis being this horrible substance, this idea that he was raised with. But once he got over that hump, and he was experiencing, less pain in his body, he was able to, go to the washroom again. Selena said that he was won over by this idea that cannabis could really improve, where he was at. And for her grandmother, who was suffering from Alzheimer's, that jam allowed her to have a lot more lucid moments, more laughter. She would shed a lot of that anxiety and that fear that comes with dementia and not knowing what's going on all the time. And really, when it came to sort of their dying process, their last stages of life, cannabis was able to sort of bring a sense of calm and peace to them. And also, of course, to Selena, the caregiver. So she said cannabis played a huge role in their family in that whole process of losing, elderly family members. Mm-hmm. Super powerful stuff for sure.
I think I can hear a reaction, and it's definitely society's voice internalized in me, which is like something along the lines of, oh, you're tainting the dying process by giving them these recreational drugs or whatever. But I think something that anyone who has been with a dying person, especially in the modern industrialized medical world, has to realize is that dying people are, in the percentage of people on antidepressants and painkillers, dying people are a vast percentage of those people. Mm-hmm. Dying, especially without a lot of cultural meaning to support it, is a very anxious time for people. A lot of depression, a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety. and also a lot of pain, physical pain because of the processes that are bringing them into death, and also because of the total pain, which is a reference to the pain that is in the body and is experienced in the body as a counterpart or as a piece of the larger psychological load of pain that is so intense, that it offsets itself into the body to sort of protect the mind, and also the feedback, the stress feedback loop and stuff. And that dying people are on extreme amounts of drugs just to mitigate this pain. And I personally think the idea of not giving them SSRIs and, opioids that basically make them feel almost nothing, and also cap their psychological, spiritual experiences in a certain bandwidth, which is what SSRIs do, to give them cannabis and have similar results without the limiting and damaging factors of these other drugs is, personally, it seems undeniably a better course of action, at least in the sense of it being considered first.
Totally. I would agree with you 100% there. It's funny, I did sort of a panel chat with Selena and some other people on this a couple of months ago, and afterwards there was a gentleman who stood up in the audience and he's like, how do I get this in my care home? And I thought that was just so like, wow, like what if we could get cannabis into care homes, like for these elderly people who we've essentially warehoused? I think it really would just be we'd just see such a shift in the way people treat the elderly. A
couple months ago, my buddy sends me a text message, and it's a picture of him holding a bag of edibles, like gummies. And he said I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was maybe funnier than the way I'm putting it now, which was like, lol, just got a hookup from my dad's friend at the home, which was like, actually, they were like, would you like some cannabis edibles inside the home? Because they're sharing them amongst each other. So, it's happening on the sly, that's for sure.
Good, yeah.
Another thing to consider too is I know that, and there's good reason, there's a cultural assumption that cannabis shuts off your brain and makes you sort of like, blah. But the reality is that, that's only certain dosages with certain strains, and that actually cannabis can produce lively, interesting, and complex discussions, spiritually meaningful conversations. And sharing cannabis as a care provider or a loved one with a dying loved one, I think, and the experience that would come with that, all the emotions, positive and negative, the conversations, the stories, I think that's an extremely positive contribution to everyone involved in a dying person's process. So just putting that out there too.
I would totally agree. Man, if I could go back and share a little edible with my grandparents who've all now passed on, I would totally have done it. I think I was too young at the time, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, what are we at here? 45 minutes ish. Let's get into negatives. Okay. So, there's one clinical negative that I want to ask you about. But before we get there, I want to sort of acknowledge that there is a stereotype. And the stereotype is something along the lines of pot smokers are lazy and can't get their life together. And that stereotype is mostly false. However, it is also based in some truth, otherwise it wouldn't prevail. So can you talk a little bit about the possible negative consequences of chronic cannabis use on motivation, and whether or not that's the cannabis or something else, or what's going on there? If you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Definitely. So I think when we look at, the way people use things like cannabis, things like coffee, things like pharmaceuticals, cocaine, whatever, what have you. These are things that, alter your mood. And I think if you're using cannabis for something like altering your mood and you get really reliant on it, once anything that you're using starts to result in negative things in your life. Let's say you're no longer interested in having a social life. You're not showing up to work on time. All of these things. Once you start to experience, negative things in your life because of something like cannabis, of course, that's entirely a negative thing. And I think when you're using cannabis in that way, you're altering your brain in a way that is not being beneficial to you. Yes, there's a point where it'll take you to where you're going to become not anxious, but I think when you become sort of habitually used to consuming cannabis, on the regular, and it just becomes a habit for you, you're losing those benefits because it's not doing what it was originally doing for you. I think that has a lot to do with tolerance, of course. And that applies to anything. That applies to booze and coffee. Once you start having more, your tolerance is going to change. And so definitely some negatives to over consuming cannabis. We hear about this cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, something that I've never experienced. But I think this is all, a result of perhaps becoming too reliant on cannabis. Don't get me wrong, cannabis is a wonderful thing. I use it fairly regularly, but I know that if I'm using it morning and lunchtime and afternoon and in the evening, I'm going to just sort of, kind of become that unmotivated person that you were sort of talking about. So that stereotype exists for that reason, I think, because some people have the tendency to overuse cannabis. And in my mind, that's sort of where that stereotype exists. It's the person who, enjoys cannabis perhaps a little bit too much, too frequently, to the point where it's creating some negative, side effects in their life, I guess.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting too because it's like some people use it every single day, all day, every day, and it turns them into the best possible version of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And other people do the exact same thing, maybe the exact same strains, and they descend into, being iterations of this horrendous stereotype. And for myself, I look at, and you live in Vancouver, so I know I would be surprised if you don't recognize Gabor Mate. But one of the things that he talks about is how, addiction is not a problem. It's it's a solution being used to a problem. It's a poor solution. And so when I think about the kind of people who, are, that stereotype, I wonder about why it is that they began using the cannabis at all, because chances are it's like most of the time when we use drugs and they become problems, there's different factors, of course, there's lots of factors, but one of those factors is self-medicating, like people
Absolutely.
who drink, people who say people who take meth, perhaps chances are in the beginning, maybe they were just self-medicating for undiagnosed ADHD, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe some deep trauma they have that they can't slow down because their nervous system is afraid that it's going to drop into like a dorsal vagal life threat mode. And so they have to constantly mobilize. So they take drugs. Or people who feel powerless, so they take cocaine. And eventually, they become powerless to the cocaine. And similar in cannabis, it's like maybe they take cannabis because they are under so much psychological, emotional distress all the time, and it eases that. But then there isn't it's outside of a supportive context. It's not medicine. It's medicine in some sense, but it's not being held, grounded around a regulating factor such as a physician or a therapist or a psychiatrist. And then it starts to then become infused with other behaviors that worsen the situation, worsen issues, say like other behaviors such as gaming, for example, which is incredibly damaging to the brain if it's excessive, and to a person's entire life, or pornography, internet pornography or whatever. And so sometimes when I think about questions like, look at what this cannabis did to this person, it's like, no, chances are what you're looking at is the cannabis saving them from something that would be much worse. The problem is what it is that it's saving them from, not the cannabis necessarily. Exactly. Does that make sense to you?
Totally. I totally agree with everything you've said there. I think, we're just trying to get through our lives, and for people who are dealing with, a lot of stress, a lot of, like you said, perhaps trauma, cannabis can be a way to escape that. But, you need to involve other things like therapy, like
Right. If you
I
want
don't
to
know,
actually heal.
exercise to heal yourself. Of course, I think I'll just speak about myself a little bit right now. I have post-traumatic stress disorder, and in the time before I got diagnosed, I was like writing a book and working all the time. And I would consume cannabis, and I'd be like, okay, like it's fine. I'm gonna get through this. It'll totally be all right. And then I interviewed someone in the book, and he listed off all the PTSD symptoms, and I was like, holy shit, I'm experiencing all of those. And the next day, I went to figure the rest out, and now I'm at a point where cannabis is not helping me escape. It's helping me process things, and I'm in therapy and dealing with all this other stuff. And I think if you don't include all those other things, a healthy diet and all of that, I mean, it's all tied together, your gut, your brain, all of that. And so I think if you're just neglecting all those other parts of your life, then cannabis is not going to serve you in the way that you think it is. Yeah.
I just want to like make a big call out to psychotherapy right now, because thing is that chances are we were wounded in relationship, and we are only going to heal in relationship. And it's extremely difficult to self-regulate and to see all the angles and to feel nourished and supported when it's just you. And so for anyone listening who's suffering, please make an effort to find a psychotherapist if you can. And I'm sorry in advance for all the bad psychotherapy that exists out there. But there is good psychotherapy, and it would be extremely helpful to have a supportive person in your life, as I can speak for experientially yourself as well.
Very important. Super important. I think everybody should be in therapy at least once in their lives. I think it's so crucial to really work out all those things in your brain that are telling you that you're shitty or you're not doing this right. Or
Also, I do also want to acknowledge privilege, because I was privileged to have the money. And I also, if I were desperate, I would have been privileged to have it provided to me by the Canadian government. And that is not the case for a lot of people, for a lot of different sort of both acute and systemic reasons. And so I want to express, I think I have a little bit of grief around that, and just want to say it's not so easy as go see a therapist, and I acknowledge that.
Totally. And, the public systems in Canada and in the States for mental health support are just garbage.
Yeah.
It's really hard to access. So, to anyone out there who's feeling that, I am been there and it sucks, and I'm sorry. And I wish things were better and they were more accessible. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to something. You referenced it, but it's the clinical danger. Cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
So we're seeing this a lot in the media, that there's this phenomenon that individuals who are using lots and lots of cannabis, they experience nausea, intense vomiting. I think I've heard it referred to as scromiting, because someone said it sounded like, or it felt like screaming and vomiting at the same time, and I was like, oh, that sounds horrible.
That sounds like ayahuasca.
Right? I'm like, oh, that sounds like another drug. But anyway, yeah. And so the idea is that they're using so much cannabis that it's sort of turning that endocannabinoid system on its head, and experiencing vomiting, nausea. And this is interesting to me, that the only thing that sort of can relieve that experience or that feeling is a really hot shower. And physicians who do, see these people coming into the emergency room, that's how they determine, okay, that's exactly what you have. Is as soon as a patient says something like, yeah, the only thing that makes me feel better is a hot shower, they're like, okay, that's, you're suffering from cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Not something I've experienced myself or even witnessed, but, I don't deny that it's out there. We wouldn't be reading and hearing about it if it wasn't a real thing. I think, it's separate from this whole idea that, the stigma around cannabis use, that it makes you lazy or what have you. I think, there really is a clinical, it's a negative thing that is out there that we need to acknowledge. And so what I would say to people who perhaps are consuming a lot, and if you're getting to the point where your cannabis consumption is no longer having an effect on your brain and you're just consuming for the sake of it, it's probably time to take what I like to call a tea break or a tolerance break. And that's a really great way of sort of preventing these things from happening. I think that, like I said, this is not something I've personally experienced or witnessed, but something we certainly need to watch out for.
So this is something that some people will experience with what we would consider a reasonable amount of cannabis, a very small amount of people, and something that a larger subsection of people will experience at extreme levels of cannabis consumption. Is that right?
Definitely. It definitely has a lot to do with the amount of cannabis that you're consuming. If you're one of these people that's consuming all day, and it's not really having an effect on you, eventually that flips, I guess, and you get to the point of scromiting, which scares the crap out of me. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like the increased prevalence of this. Obviously, there's more cannabis media. There's more knowledge about cannabis. There's more likeliness that somebody going to a hospital is going to openly admit that they take cannabis. So there's a lot of factors that might be, relevant in considering why we're noticing this clinical issue. And another one I wonder about is the increase and the cultural fetish around concentrates, especially dabbing. I mean, there are videos out there that show people dabbing like 30 grams of shatter in without taking a breath. And I've heard stories, I don't know if they're true, of people who dab a bunch and then they end up getting taken to the hospital with what looks like Parkinson's symptoms. So what are your thoughts on the role that this sort of hyped up dab culture has on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, or even just generally?
I think in a general sense, it has a really negative effect on cannabis culture as a whole, on the people who consume it. Don't get me wrong. I like to do dabs. I do them sometimes, but I'm not one of these slab dab, several grams at a time people. And I don't really understand the motivation other than your ego and you want to show off to people on Instagram. But what's the point if it's just going to make you feel unpleasant? I think it's definitely an aspect of the culture that hopefully we won't be seeing a whole lot of anymore. I think it doesn't really have a positive effect in any sense. Yeah, and I think it definitely has something to do with the fact that we're seeing more people suffering from cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. This is not me knocking dabs at all. I understand that for some people it's the best modality for them to use. It's the most effective for their symptoms, what they're dealing with. That's, if you're using it with purpose and it's doing what it needs you to do, I think all the power to you. But when it gets to the point where, you're influencing other people to do bigger dabs and it's just this big, show off kind of thing, it really doesn't do anything for how far we've come with cannabis. In fact, I think it sort of pushes that back a little bit. And I really think, I'm hoping that once, I'm really excited for concentrates to become regulated or legalized in Canada, because it's going to help people realize that, they're not as terrifying as we make them out to be. But I think it's also going to, perhaps allow people to think of it in a different way, that we don't have to be consuming such a large quantity of concentrated cannabis at one time. Never something I could wrap my head around. And I've always kind of, I don't know. I don't mean to sound like I'm turning my nose up to anything. It's just, it doesn't really lend to, all the work that people have been doing for, this movement to make cannabis legal, to make it accepted as a medicinal substance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I see that, I saw that video because I was interested. I was another one of those many thousands and thousands of views. And as somebody who, makes their living on creating internet content, I understand the desire to produce videos that people will want to watch over and over and over again. And the tendency to want to feel like you've accomplished something great, as well as the tendency to want to see people do extreme shit. So all of that into consideration as well. But I really do agree with you on many. I do agree with you totally. Before we close, Let's see. I got some political questions. Are you ready to go into politics?
Yes.
Hopefully we'll still stay friends after.
No,
So, I mean, that's
sure.
actually a terrible reference that we can't have uncomfortable conversations without destroying connections, which I think is a part and parcel of two things. One, completely dysfunctional society insofar as having to actually grapple with the realities of human life. And two, likely a propagated stereotype that is used to subjugate the people against the power of the government to make it so that we can't actually talk with each other. And we've just internalized those stereotypes and effectively given our power away through infighting about bullshit and hyperreactivity rather than actually listening and talking and coming to real terms on what might work for everybody involved. That said, let's talk about politics.
Yes.
How do you feel about the current move Canada has taken insofar as what's being called legalization? I'm not really sure, like I'm more of a proponent personally for decriminalization. But I see legalization in many ways as prohibition 2.0, and funneling everything into government profit, and that the government actually doesn't really give a shit about the people's planet at all. They're only doing what they can to A, get attention and support of the people, like basically get the millennial vote, and B, make money, and that there's positive effect is just an afterthought, I assume. But how about yourself? How do you feel about the Canadian legalization process that we've underwent here this year, or I guess
Well,
technically last year?
yeah, I think it's definitely flawed. I would agree with you that I'm a proponent of decriminalization first, for sure. I mean, in some respects, I can say that it sets an example for other countries in the world that may have a little bit of a old school thinking about cannabis, but on the home front, it's hugely lacking. And for me, the biggest thing that it's missing, the Cannabis Act, is how can you make a substance legal and then still have people in prison who a couple years ago may have dealt or what have you, or even people who are perhaps not in prison but still affected by a criminal record. They can't cross the border, they can't find a decent job because of this criminal record for a substance that now everybody else is allowed to consume. Yeah, so for me, I would have liked to see some sort of legislation that allowed for expungement for people that have these records. And I'm not talking about pardons. I know Justin Trudeau has thrown out this idea of pardons, like, oh yeah, we're gonna open this up.
Yeah, just like he threw up changing the electoral system. Yeah, I'm sure he'll follow through.
Totally. And so I think that was just a one-off. I don't think he's ever going to revisit that, or he's going to make it an election issue. I don't know. But for me, the legislation is lacking, particularly on that front. We need some way for people who are, suffering because of their records, because of their previous experiences with cannabis, to be able to clear that up. And the other thing, I mean, there's several things. I could talk about this ad nauseum. Like, it's just
Go for it.
It's ridiculous that there are more penalties for people for using cannabis now than there were. Like, and the how like strong and crazy these penalties are. Like, if I share a joint with a 19-year-old, I could go to prison for 10 years. Pardon me, like I believe that's even longer than the maximum sentence for someone who's committed sexual assault. Like, let's put that in perspective. This is a joint that I'm gonna, like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Share with somebody who is otherwise legally able to drink alcohol in every other province, which is widely more dangerous.
Of course, yeah. I mean, that and the driving laws. I just read this story on Vice about a woman who is a medical cannabis user, who got pulled over, was found not to be impaired, still got her license taken away and her car impounded because it showed that she was positive for THC. What? Like, I just had to read that article over 3 times and was like, well, do I have to give up my vehicle? Do I have to start taking the bus everywhere? I use cannabis medicinally. I'm not getting in the car stoned, but I may, THC is fat soluble. It stays in your body for 30 days. So how are we going to deal with this? That for me is a huge thing too. Yeah, and it really is making it more challenging for medicinal users to obtain cannabis because so much of the product is being diverted to the rec market. Then we have licensed producers who are, shipping their product across the ocean to Germany and Denmark. And so I think there are so many kinks that really need to be worked out. It really feels to me like this is not done for Canadians. This was done for industry, for lobbyists. I mean, I'm very grateful to the people who have been working at this to try and make cannabis more accepted in Canada. But I think in following, a lot of the laws that have been created in places like Colorado, we've kind of just failed to create something that works for Canada. We've picked and chosen aspects of regulations from different jurisdictions, and nothing really suits this giant country. And, the fact that federally things are different than, in each province it's just very confusing for the consumer, especially in a place like Vancouver where we have all these unregulated dispensaries. A lot of them are beginning to close down, but, the average consumer, they know that, okay, cannabis was legalized on October 17th. Now I'm going to go to the dispensary. They don't think that, oh, well, now I have to go to a legal store or I have to order from this legal website. That wasn't really explained very well to the majority of Canadians. And so, I think it's fraught with with issues. I mean, yes, it's, the first iteration of this legislation, but I think so much of it needs to change. Yeah.
I highly doubt it's going to change very much. I notice as you're speaking, I'm getting really angry, and that's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for me to get really angry about like the way the government operates. I know people look around and objectively Canada is an excellent place to live in a lot of ways. And subjectively living here, it's very much a culturally divided country where the populace is placated inside of what is essentially like a gilded cage or a golden cage. Yeah. And it is really frustrating and brings up a lot of anger in me, which I have chosen to express in a very calm tone because I'm not sure how much benefit it'll do for me to just yell at no one in particular on my soapbox here. Why don't we draw a close? I'm gonna go smoke a joint. Let's draw to a close. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about sort of like the synopses of your book, where and how they can buy it, and your social media handles.
Absolutely. So this is my book. It is The Little Book of Cannabis, How Marijuana Can Improve Your Life. You can find it at Chapters, on Amazon, pretty much anywhere you can find books. If you're in the States, you can just go to littlebookofcannabis.com, and then I have a list of all the different retailers. My social media handles, I'm at Amanda_Seibert on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm on Facebook, but fuck Facebook. Just follow me on Twitter. That's more fun. And thanks. I really enjoy, talking about the subject. It was great to chat about with someone who's totally in it, and this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation, second conversation. So it's nice to have talked with you more than once, and the listeners will be familiar with what's coming, which is that you can find all those links to Amanda's books and her social media in the show notes for this episode at jameswjesso.com. Amanda Seibert, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And cut. Okay, that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, of course, go check out Amanda's book, The Little Book of Cannabis. Really a wonderful, cool read. Nice to have on your shelf. Also, my personal experience with having read it, I enjoyed it. And I also felt like this is a great book to give people who aren't already informed on why cannabis is so positive and the stigma is so completely unfounded. So it might make for a great Christmas gift to a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or somebody in your life who just needs a little sort of like a gentle authoritarian, what's the word I'm looking for? some gentle authority on the subject that invites them out of the stigma and into a broader, more complete, I'd say, more evidence-based perspective on the plant. So definitely check out the Little Book of Cannabis. I thought it was quite good, especially for that particular function. Share the episode on whatever social media you're all about. Reviews of the podcast, likes, comments, shares, wherever you're seeing it. Basically, any engagement is good engagement, unless you're being an a-hole and trolling, which even then is fine, but I might have something sassy and crass to say to you in response. But yeah, so that's great. Please help push the show around. It grows because you care, not because I invest in marketing, because that's not really my thing personally. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks to the people who choose to go to jameswjesso.com/support to leave a PayPal donation or become a patron or buy something. Really appreciate your financial contributions to the production of the show. And I will see you on the next episode. Thanks very much, and enjoy this outro from the Tin Box. Bye.